I have stood in rooms where the air itself felt wrong. I have prayed over men and women whose bodies contorted and whose voices dropped to registers that no human throat should be able to produce. I have spent decades studying the architecture of evil, the hierarchies of fallen intelligence, and the precise mechanisms by which demonic forces press against the fabric of human civilization. And I will tell you this with the full weight of that experience behind every word. What is happening right now, in this moment, in this century, in this church, and in this world, is not ordinary. The disorder you feel is not a political problem. It is not an economic problem. It is not a sociological shift that the next election or the next council document will resolve. What is happening is eschatological in character, meaning it belongs to that category of events that precede a divine reckoning, and it was described with terrible precision by a woman who died in 1179, who had never seen a smartphone or a synod report or a government mandate about what may be taught in a classroom, and yet who saw all of it. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, and what she saw is going to shake the world. I want to be careful here because there is a great deal of noise in Catholic circles about prophecy, and most of it is spiritually irresponsible. People attach themselves to seers and locutionists and visionaries with an eagerness that tells you more about their anxiety than about genuine supernatural discernment. Private revelation, properly understood in Thomistic categories, is not a second gospel. It does not add to the deposit of faith. It is not binding on the faithful in the way that defined doctrine is binding, and no Catholic is required to accept any private revelation whatsoever, including apparitions that have received full church approval. That needs to be said plainly, because the opposite error, the wholesale dismissal of private revelation, as beneath the dignity of serious Catholics, is equally wrong and arguably more dangerous in the present moment. St. Thomas teaches us in the Summa that God, in his providence, does not abandon his people without warning. The prophetic charism exists precisely because divine mercy wills to give the faithful the spiritual intelligence they need to navigate historical crises that would otherwise overwhelm them. When that charism is exercised by a soul of verified holiness, whose life and doctrine and fruits have been examined by legitimate authority and found sound, the prudent Catholic does not shrug and walk away. The prudent Catholic listens. Hildegard of Bingen was not a peripheral figure. She was not a mystic whose visions circulated in handwritten copies among credulous village women. She was an abbess, a theologian, a composer, a physician, a preacher who addressed crowds across Germany and France at the express invitation of bishops and abbots, a woman whose correspondence included 4 popes, 2 emperors, and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the most intellectually formidable churchman of her century. When Bernard read her work and gave it his endorsement, that was not a casual gesture. Bernard was constitutionally incapable of endorsing anything he found doctrinally soft or spiritually theatrical. He was a man who had spent years dismantling the errors of Peter Abelard, who understood that the Church's greatest enemies were not always the ones attacking from outside, but often the ones innovating from within. His approval of Hildegard meant something precise, that what she had written and what she had seen passed the most rigorous theological scrutiny available in that era. Pope Eugenius III formally approved her first major prophetic work, the Scivias, meaning Know the Ways, in 1147. She was later canonized and in 2012 declared a Doctor of the Church by Pope Benedict XVI, placing her permanently in the company of the highest theological authorities the Church has ever recognized. When I speak about Hildegard, I am not speaking about someone operating in a gray zone. I'm speaking about a fully approved, fully authenticated voice of Catholic prophetic tradition, and what she said about the condition of the Church in the world before a great divine correction deserves to be heard with complete seriousness. She described the corruption of the clergy in terms so specific that reading them today produces a sensation very close to vertigo. She spoke of priests who would abandon the gravity of their office and seek the approval of the world, who would dress and speak and conduct themselves in ways indistinguishable from secular men, who would empty the sacred rites of their weight in order to attract those who had no real appetite for holiness, but only for a religion that demanded nothing. She described bishops who would function as administrators and politicians rather than shepherds and fathers, who would make alliances with civil power at the cost of prophetic witness, who would silence those among their priests who spoke plainly about sin and judgment because plain speech about sin and judgment made the powerful uncomfortable. I need you to listen to this message very carefully, Sess, because what I'm about to reveal could protect your health and perhaps even save your life. For a long time, I didn't realize the danger that excess blood sugar represented. I discovered that high glucose levels can increase the risk of heart attack, stroke, vision loss, and even amputations. The scariest thing is that type 2 diabetes often acts silently. Many people believe everything is fine when, in fact, their bodies are already suffering serious damage. And if your blood sugar is high right now, you may be at much greater risk than you imagine. But then I discovered a completely natural method that helped me understand how to balance my blood sugar levels and regain my quality of life. Thousands of people are also discovering this simple method and learning how to naturally reduce excess sugar and avoid the dangers of type 2 diabetes. And there's something important you need to know. All this information is compiled in a special video that we don't know how long will be available. If you want to discover what I discovered and learn a natural way to help control your blood sugar levels, click the link in the first pinned comment now and watch the video before it's taken down. She saw a church in which the external forms of religion would be maintained while the interior substance drained away, a church in which the buildings remained standing and the liturgical calendar continued to be observed and the offices continued to be filled, but in which the fire that had animated all of it had been largely extinguished by human cowardice and human ambition and human accommodation to a world that had declared war on everything supernatural. She called this condition, using the Latin of her visions, a kind of spiritual effeminacy, a collapse of the virile courage that the faith requires, a dissolution of the willingness to suffer for truth that alone distinguishes the shepherd from the hireling. And she said that this condition would reach its fullest expression immediately before God intervened. Now, I want to be precise about what I mean when I invoke the Thomistic framework here, because this is not merely academic. St. Thomas, following Augustine and Aristotle, teaches that God is the primary cause of all things, and that secondary causes, meaning human actions, natural events, angelic and demonic activity, operate always within the permission and governance of divine providence. Nothing happens outside that governance. Not the rise of a corrupt regime, not the silencing of a holy bishop, not the spread of a heresy through seminaries, not the demonic pressure that accelerates cultural dissolution. All of it falls within a providential architecture that is moving toward an end that God has already determined, and that no human malice and no fallen angel can ultimately derail. This is not fatalism. Fatalism says that nothing matters because everything is fixed. Thomistic providence says that everything matters precisely because God has chosen to work through the free acts of rational creatures, and the choices you make today, the prayers you say today, the sacraments you receive today, the courage you exercise or fail to exercise today, are real secondary causes within that providential order. Hildegard understood this. Her prophecies were never given as passive predictions for people to watch unfold from a safe distance. They were always accompanied by an imperative: act, pray, convert, prepare, resist. The warning was inseparable from the command. What she saw regarding the corruption of doctrine was equally specific and equally disturbing. She described a period in which teachers within the church would introduce novelties under the appearance of deeper understanding, claiming that the tradition had been too narrow, too rigid, too disconnected from the human experience of successive ages, and that a more expansive interpretation of revelation was needed to speak to modern souls. She saw these teachers gaining influence not through the force of their argument, because their arguments, examined carefully, dissolved under scrutiny, but through the force of their position and their institutional access and their ability to make orthodoxy seem provincial and embarrassing to those who desperately wanted the church's approval and the world's approval simultaneously. She saw younger clergy and younger religious absorbing these novelties not out of deep conviction, but out of the simple human desire to belong, to be accepted, to avoid the particular social suffering that comes from holding positions the educated class has decided are beneath contempt. And she saw the faithful, the ordinary lay faithful who had no theological formation and no institutional power, becoming progressively confused, unable to distinguish between what the church had always taught and what was being quietly substituted for it, losing their footing on the doctrinal ground that their ancestors had stood on with perfect confidence. She described this as a kind of spiritual fog, a darkening of the interior sense by which the soul recognizes truth. And she located its ultimate cause not in human stupidity, but in demonic intelligence, in the precise, patient, centuries-long project of principalities and powers, who understand that if you can corrupt the teacher, you corrupt the student, and if you corrupt the student, across enough generations, you produce a people who no longer know what they have lost. I have seen this fog in the confessional. I have seen it in the faces of people who come to me not knowing whether what they have been told by their parish priest or their Catholic school teacher or their diocesan newsletter is actually Catholic. People who have a genuine and sincere desire to be faithful, but who have been given such a distorted and diluted version of the faith that their fidelity has no solid object. This is a particular kind of spiritual cruelty, and Hildegard named it for what it is, a pastoral abandonment. The shepherd who will not speak plainly to the sheep about the wolf does not love the sheep. He loves his own comfort, his own reputation, his own relationship with the diocesan bureaucracy, his own standing at the parish council dinner. The sheep he was ordained to feed and protect he leaves to the wolf's discretion, and then he congratulates himself on his pastoral sensitivity. Hildegard had no patience for this, and neither do I. The tradition she represented, the tradition that runs from the Desert Fathers through Benedict, through Bernard, through Aquinas, through Pius X, is a tradition that understood the pastoral office as inherently demanding, inherently sacrificial, inherently oriented toward the salvation of souls rather than the management of institutional relationships. When that orientation is lost, you do not have a church that has modernized. You have a church that has abandoned its reason for existing. The prophecy that most directly addresses our present moment concerns what Hildegard called the time of the great comet, or in some translations, the great sign in the heavens, which she associated with a period of intensifying natural and supernatural disorder preceding a purification. She was not alone among approved Catholic mystics in describing this sequence. Corruption reaches its maximum. The faithful remnant is reduced and persecuted. A warning or sign occurs that removes all possible excuse for ignorance, and then the correction comes. You find this pattern in St. John Bosco, in the prophecies associated with La Salette, in the Fatima Secret, in the words of Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich. The convergence across centuries and cultures and distinct visionary experiences is theologically significant. It is not the kind of convergence you explain by mutual influence, because many of these figures had no access to each other's works. It is the kind of convergence that suggests a common supernatural source, communicating a consistent message to the Church across time, a message the Church's official teachers have always been careful to neither define as dogma nor dismiss as superstition. The prudential position is to attend to this convergence seriously, to weigh it against the state of the world you can observe with your own eyes, and to ask yourself with complete honesty whether what you see around you matches the pattern these witnesses described. What I observe around me matches it with a precision I find personally sobering. The dissolution of the family as the basic unit of civilization, advancing not merely in secular culture, but within Catholic institutions. The normalization of moral positions that the Church condemned without ambiguity for 2,000 years, not merely in the secular press, but in statements from church offices and pastoral documents that speak of accompanying and discerning where the tradition spoke of repenting and converting. The reduction of the liturgy to a therapeutic exercise in communal affirmation, stripped of the vertical dimension that makes it an act of worship rather than an act of self-celebration. The replacement of catechesis with a kind of emotional management program designed to make young people feel good about being vaguely spiritual rather than form them in the precise and demanding truth of the Catholic faith. The persecution, now largely institutional rather than physical, of priests and bishops who maintain positions that their predecessors held without controversy 20 years ago. Hildegard saw all of this. She described it as the penultimate chapter, the chapter that precedes the correction, and she was explicit that the correction would be severe, that it would not spare the institutions that had failed in their duty, that it would come from outside human management and human planning, because human management and human planning had been precisely the problem. But here's what she also said, and this is the part that the sensationalist accounts always omit, the part that matters most to the person sitting in the pew or kneeling in the confessional. She said that through this entire period, the sacraments would retain their full power. The Mass, valid and properly celebrated, would continue to convey the grace it had always conveyed. The confessional would continue to absolve. The Eucharist would continue to be the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, regardless of the institutional chaos surrounding it. The scapular would still be what Our Lady said it would be. The rosary would still break demonic strongholds. The faithful remnant, the people who clung to the fullness of the tradition, not out of nostalgia but out of genuine supernatural faith, would be protected not from suffering but through it. She described them using the image of the Anoim, the poor of Yahweh from the Hebrew prophetic tradition, the small and powerless who possess nothing except their fidelity, and in whose fidelity God deposits the seed of the renewal that follows the chastisement. This is the constant pattern of salvation history. God does not work through the powerful and the comfortable. He works through the faithful and the small. The great cathedral collapses, and the hidden monastery preserves the fire. What this means practically for the person listening to me right now is something I want to state with the same directness Hildegard herself used. You do not have the luxury of spiritual mediocrity. The era in which a Catholic could maintain a tepid, intermittent, culturally comfortable relationship with the faith and call it sufficient is over. It may have never truly been sufficient in the sight of God, but the external conditions that made it socially tolerable are dissolving rapidly. And what remains when those conditions have fully dissolved will be the content of your interior life, the depth of your prayer, the frequency and sincerity of your sacramental practice, the firmness of your doctrinal convictions, and the degree to which your home and your family have been formed by the faith rather than merely decorated with its symbols. Hildegard wrote letters to lay people, not just to abbots and emperors, and in those letters she was as direct with them as she was with anyone. She told them that the faith was not an ornament, it was armor. An armor that was not maintained and fitted correctly offered no protection when the battle reached you personally. The demonic dimension of this moment cannot be separated from the prophetic dimension, and I say this not to frighten, but to provide the correct theological framework for understanding what is happening. The demons know that time is short, not in the sense that they have access to divine secrets they are not permitted to know, but in the sense that centuries of gradual erosion are reaching a climax, and they are pressing with unusual intensity precisely because this moment is decisive. I have observed this in exorcism contexts, in the behavior of entities under formal ecclesiastical examination, in the particular vehemence with which certain spiritual attacks have intensified in recent years against faithful priests and faithful families and faithful institutions. The enemy does not increase his effort where the resistance is already broken. He increases his effort where the resistance is holding, because what holds is what threatens him. When you feel the particular heaviness that characterizes this cultural moment, the sense that everything solid is becoming unstable, that the landmarks you relied on are being removed, that the people and institutions you trusted are failing, understand that this feeling is not accidental, and it is not merely psychological. It has an intelligent cause, and that cause is terrified of what happens when the people of God hold firm. Hildegard described the renewal that follows the correction in terms that should sustain your courage through whatever comes before it. She saw a church purified of its human corruption, smaller but incandescent, without the institutional ambition and the political calculation that had obscured its supernatural character, preaching the full truth with the full authority that comes from having no earthly power left to protect. She saw a priesthood renewed in holiness, celebrating the sacred rites with the reverence and the precision that those rites demand, feeding the faithful with the genuine bread of doctrine rather than the processed substitute that had been offered for so long. She saw the family restored to its proper dignity as the domestic church, the primary site of supernatural formation, the school of the virtues that public culture had stopped teaching and public institutions had stopped honoring. She saw young people, in particular, turning toward the faith with a hunger that surprised even the faithful remnant who had preserved it, because hunger is the natural response to prolonged starvation, and a generation that has been fed nothing but spiritual empty calories will recognize real food when it finally encounters it. This is the end of the story she told, not the chastisement, not the collapse of corrupted structures, but the renewal, the spring that follows the harshest winter, the restoration that God always effects through the remnant that holds. What you must do, and I am speaking to you as a confessor and as a priest who has spent a lifetime in the spiritual combat that Hildegard described with such precision, is very simple, even if it is not easy. You must go to confession, and you must go regularly, and you must make a genuine examination of conscience rather than the vague gestures toward self-awareness that pass for confession in too many parishes. You must receive the Eucharist worthily and frequently, understanding that you are not receiving a symbol of community solidarity, but the living God, the same God before, whose presence the seraphim veil their faces, and you must bring to that reception the reverence and the preparation that such a reality demands. You must pray the Rosary as if your soul and the souls of your family depend on it, because the evidence of 5 centuries of Catholic spiritual tradition and the testimony of every serious exorcist I have ever spoken with is that it does. You must form your home in the explicit and unapologetic practice of the faith, not as a cultural tradition you maintain out of ethnic sentiment, but as a supernatural reality you have staked your life and the lives of your children on. You must find a confessor who will tell you the truth, a priest who has not made his peace with the corruption Hildegard described, who will give you the actual medicine rather than the reassurance that everything is fine. And you must understand, with the full theological clarity that this moment demands, that what is coming is not the end of the story. It is, as Hildegard saw, the beginning of a chapter that God has been preparing through the suffering of his faithful people for longer than any of us can imagine. Do not be afraid. Be ready.